What you're going to hear now is nothing less than a bombshell interview with Professor Dr. Ola Tunander from the Peace Research Institute Oslo, the first peace research institute in the world. He is a specialist for security policies and wrote his doctor thesis on US naval strategy. But we will not only talk about the past, which is the US deception operations in Sweden, US and British deception operations, but also the present, the Nord Stream pipeline explosions and the question why Sweden and Finland joined NATO. If you understand what Ola Tunander describes in this talk about the background of the Cold War, the late Cold War since the Reagan years, and what is happening now, it will be even harder to understand why these two countries chose the path that they've chosen. If you want to understand what was going on, this interview is essential. It is something that you will never hear on CNN or BBC. So buckle up and listen.
Im Gespräch.
Ola, thank you for doing this interview. What we will be discussing is really a bombshell because it's a new perspective on the Swedish submarine affair. We have done, I would say, a documentary together because it mostly relied on your research, and I've done a few interviews around it. 2 times really, and now there's a new publication which puts it into a different light because the question always was how much intention. But to understand, so the audience can understand what we're talking about, we should start, I think, at the very beginning, which is the Cold War. So if you want to give a short outline what the Cold War was then and is again now, but we don't get into what it is right now. But a short history of the Cold War.
Yeah, the US wanted to contain the Soviet power. That was the idea from the late 40s. And there were certain people in the 1950s, like the CIA director Alan Dulles, that wanted to roll back the Soviet power. But this never succeeded. These people were not on top, so to speak. The president were always wanted to have a kind of containment policy, which was a kind of status quo policy. You didn't want to risk a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. That was the American perspective. And there were definitely people inside the US who wanted to have this nuclear war, at least in the 50s and 60s. But later on, it became more status quo oriented, actually. And you had during the Nixon administration, during the Carter administration, this changed with President Ronald Reagan in 1981. And he and some of his top advisors, or the Secretary of Defense, Weinberger, and Director of Central Intelligence, the CIA, Bill Casey, they wanted to win. They wanted to have a victory in the Cold War. And this meant that you were pushing the Soviets and you wanted to force them to go into very expensive wars like the one in Afghanistan. That was the purpose, the US purpose with this war was actually, it was a trap to force the Russians into a war so they would bleed, so they would have the same experience as the Americans had in Vietnam, you could say. So it would, and the Soviet economy was much weaker, and the idea was that you would force the Soviets to its knees and then it could possibly split up. That was the idea already from early on in the 1981. And then what you have in Europe at the time was relatively strong social democratic parties. in Germany. You had Willy Brandt that had later. There were Helmut Schmidt, and Helmut Schmidt was, playing to some extent with the United States on the deterrence side of it, but he wanted to have the pipelines, for example, which was a really conflict between Weinberger and Casey on the one hand, and the Germans on the other. And this kind of conflict became even more visible, perhaps, in the Scandinavian countries, because the Scandinavians were dominated by social democratic parties and parties that wanted to have a détente policy. They wanted to have a low tension to Soviet Union. They didn't want to have a risk of a real conflict with the Soviets. So that was, and Finland has a neutrality, according to, this was after the Second World War, Finland was more or less forced into a neutral position with kind of agreement with Soviet Union. And Sweden had neutrality for 150 years. So for Sweden, it was very natural to continue in neutrality. It was a West-leaning neutrality. And some people in Sweden were collaborating very closely with the Americans and the British. But, and in Norway, they have decided already before they joined NATO decided to have a base policy that didn't allow American-British bases on Norwegian soil. They didn't allow nuclear weapons on Norwegian soil, and they didn't allow exercises of the Western exercises in the very northern part, close to Soviet Union. So these were restrictions that the Nordic countries had. And I remember one neoconservative in United States who said that, Elliot Cohen, he said that actually when you look at Norway and Sweden and so on, they were much closer when people thought at the time. Actually, they the policies were not so different. It was kind of elements of neutrality, he would argue then. And so this was when Reagan administration took over, these policies were not acceptable. The Reagan people, and not least Weinberger and Casey, they wanted to change the policy. And at the same time, you have the British, you have the Margaret Thatcher, who argued that this policy was also, which was corresponding to the Labour Party policy in Britain, but she belonged to the very hardline conservatives, and she wanted to have a change, and as an illustration, you could say that in 1981, the Norwegian Prime Minister Oddvar Nordli, at the New Year's speech, spoke about a Nordic nuclear weapon-free zone, in favor of a Nordic nuclear weapon-free zone. And the Americans and the British reacted very, very strongly. I mean, they hit the roof, for what you say. They said, this is unacceptable. The Norwegians are out on a slippery slope. That is a quote. from the document from the Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office. And we have to speak serious with the Norwegians, and the Swedes are even worse. So it was clear that Sweden Norway, you had to change. You have to speak serious with the government, but that was not enough, because the real problem was the population. The population didn't take the Soviet threat seriously, and you had to change that. And that it was a Danish political military delegation that went to London in 81, just after a Whiskey-class submarine, a Russian Whiskey-class submarine, was standing on an island. And
before we come to that, I think to once get into a very architect view of the whole conflict, it is, you have on the one hand, you have the social democratic idea of détente. And it is Olof Palme who gets Egon Bahr and Willy Brandt to do the Palme Commission, where they are supposed to look into the problem of nuclear war. In effect, it means that nuclear war is, you cannot win in nuclear war. Nobody wins it. It's only two losing sides. Those who shoot first die as the second part. So it is that he comes up with the idea that in the future we'll have to have a common security strategy, that we need to look at each other's interest, because there's no way of winning a war, so we have to avoid it together. And during this process, you can get closer. You come into a situation where it's possible to negotiate. This is what Egon Bahr told me in an interview what happened with the Berlin Wall. When the Berlin Wall was erected, they had to find ways to negotiate, because 40,000 people each day had to pass through the wall. So there needed to be small-scale adjustments to the big wall. And on that way, he noticed that it is possible to get into a détente policy, because you talk to people, there's a buildup of trust, and then with these people you can negotiate. So there's this basic idea of a possible change through rapprochement, as it was called, from the Social Democratic side. And these were forces. Sweden was the strongest one, strongest Social Democratic party in the world. Yeah. And there was the Social Democrats in Germany, because Germany was an important country, and you had Harold Wilson in Labour in England. You had Bruno Kreisky, a big negotiator from Austria, also Social Democrat. So this was a strong force of détente. And the other idea was the Reagan-Thatcher idea, as you described, victory. We'll not survive together, we'll win the Cold War, and confrontation. We'll bring them to their knees. We push them over backwards. These are the two ideas. And so the idea is from the American and British side that you have to get rid of these Europeans that are a problem in the strategy, and the problem is the Social Democrats. So this is what you describe. You have, and also you have in the northern countries, Norway, Sweden, they are willing to negotiate for a nuclear-free zone in Europe. And then what happens is this event. We come to this event now. Suddenly, in this as an overture, I would say, of the whole thing, there's a Soviet submarine running aground in Swedish waters, just 30 kilometers away from the military base in Karlskrona, the second most important military base in Sweden. So and the whole world is there to watch how the submarine sticks out of the water, and they call it Whiskey on the Rocks, because it's a whiskey-class submarine, as it's called in NATO slang. And Whiskey on the Rocks, of course, is what Whiskey on the Rocks is. So it's a meme that stuck immediately in the mind. But please continue.
Yes, yeah, no, true. But Willy Brandt was not in the commission, but he was very close to Palme and Egon Bahr, of course.
Yeah, that's Bahr told me that Palme asked both of them. This is why I say that.
Yeah, but he was not formally okay. Speaking. He was not. But no, it was the point was in a way that this was the policy of the Nordic countries was unacceptable from the Reagan and Thatcher point of view. and we have to change it. That was very clear, and you couldn't change it just by speaking harsh to the prime minister and foreign minister. That was not enough, because the population was, you had
too peaceful, too peacenik.
They collected names in support of a Nordic weapons-free zone, and this was hundreds of thousands signing up, and this was you couldn't stop it so easily. So what you did was these submarines. You pretending that it was Soviet submarines and made the Scandinavians pretty afraid. And what you had already after this first Whiskey on the Rocks submarine, the Danish delegation went to London and said, the Russians will never come back after this. I mean, it was clear for the British that the opinion really changed because of these submarines. And what you could do is to show off or show up in the Swedish archipelagos with periscopes and to show the submarine sail or whatever, and the Swedes will really change its position. And that was what happened. So it was then
there are some quite impressive figures. Maybe you can say that.
I think, during the whole 1970s and up to 1980, there were about 25 to 30% who considered Soviet Union as an immediate threat or as hostile in general to Sweden. That was the figures were from the defense research, and then 3 years later, after these submarines had been turning up all over along the Swedish coast and so on, 83% had the same view. So Sweden became a totally different country in 3 years' time. So it was and this meant also politically, it meant that the Social Democrats, who had been on the offensive before and working for health insurances and for workers' influence in the companies and to have social security and all these kind of things, this became a secondary issue because the primary issue was the threat from the Soviet Union. So it means that Social Democrats had to go on the defensive, and they also, after the most significant submarine hunt in October 1982, they had to protest strongly against the Soviet intrusions because they believed it was Soviet intrusions. Everyone almost believed it was Soviet intrusions.
But to play the devil's advocate, there was this Soviet submarine that ran aground. So why do you think that there were no Soviet intrusions? And what about this one submarine that ran aground for the whole world to see? That's an indication that you could argue, this is what was argued, that this is not the only case, it's just one that pops out.
Yeah. No, it's, of course, at the time, I believed it was Soviet submarines.
Everybody believed it.
Yeah, almost everyone. I mean, it was...
Except for people in the know.
Except for the very few who were in the know. And then also you could say that when it comes to these Whiskey on the Rocks, it's a little bit more complicated than it was just a Soviet submarine.
Yes.
Because
just to put it very short, I made an interview with the captain of that submarine, and that might be another interview, because the whole story is also, it's a bombshell. But the whole thing is that there's reason to believe it's a very fishy story. There's something wrong with the story. The way it happened is the submarine lost its navigation devices. There was a second captain aboard who gave orders that were conflicting with the real captain, and the second captain gave very strange orders, which in effect made sure that the submarine ran aground. Leave it as that for now, because we have the other bombshell. Too many bombshells in one interview is not good. So you described the situation there. After this incident, which gave the idea to the public that the Soviets are running around in the backyard, in the Swedish backyard, so to speak, playing hide and seek, there's a multitude of sightings where people see. People see periscope, people see submarine sails, they come up, very strange behavior for a submarine. But then, because there was the Soviet submarine, it is everybody thinks it's Soviet submarine, Soviet submarine, Soviet submarine, Soviet submarine, when it wasn't. But we come to that. Okay.
Yeah, and one could also mention that I spoke with Bobby Inman, but a colleague of mine spoke with Bobby Inman, who had been an assistant naval attaché in the 60s, and he said that the Soviets went in on the Swedish territorial waters, but never into the archipelagos. He was later deputy CIA, he was chief national security agency, and was chief...
So for both, he was on top of CIA, he was on top of NSA in the top staff. So he was, and the way he managed to get there was really the operations in Swedish waters and others. It was the technical side that he was able to build up a network that the oceans were under surveillance and the Americans would know where Soviet ships were at all times.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is how he made his career, and that is also important for the Swedish submarine case.
Yes, and I had a colleague who were Chief Naval Intelligence Europe in around 1970, late 60s, early 70s, where he got this information, and he briefed the admiral, the U.S. Commander-in-Chief for Naval Forces Europe, every morning at 7 o'clock, where all the submarines and all the surface ships were. And that he could do because of a deal that Bobby Inman had reached with the Swedes, with some Swedes, I would say, of about hydrophones along the Swedish coast. And
that is important again to show it's not like you think that Sweden is informed, but it is it's on a person-to-person level. It is some people who are considered good allies, good friends, or good influence agents, you can say. That all goes into one. On the Swedish side, and not everybody in the Swedish government is considered a friend, especially not the Social Democrats. So, or then there are certain Social Democrats which they have to talk to. We might come to that, Sven Andersson, after that, but to not be too specific. So the basic outline is some people in Sweden get informed, but it's very few, very few.
Yeah, and also you could say that what actually was known from the American naval intelligence side was that there were Soviet submarines training or exercising along the Swedish coast, and the same submarine captains were later going along the U.S. with nuclear submarines along the U.S. East Coast. So that was a conclusion that naval intelligence came to, and what happened from 81 onwards were submarines turning up all the time in Swedish waters, into Stockholm Harbor or in the naval base of Muskö, or it was a way that submarine, and they were showing periscopes and sails and so on in a way that submarines shouldn't do. This was obviously, afterwards you could say it was clear that this was done on purpose. You don't do these kind of things. I know I have Norwegian friends who went with submarines along the Norwegian coast to show periscope, just to test the population if they were correct so they reported back and say, we have seen a submarine because we had a periscope here and so on. And that was in majority of cases, it was Norwegian submarines testing the Norwegian public. Mm-hmm. And in this case, it was Western submarines, maybe British, and also US had submarines were not American submarines, but were from other NATO countries. And the ones that had the best submarines for this purpose were the Italians. So they were using Italian submarines for small midget submarines that could go deep into the archipelagos, to go deep into the naval bases, and actually the hydrophones that I mentioned before, what Bobby Inman had got a deal with the Swedes about, or with some Swedes, these hydrophones were maintained by small submarines that turned out to be small Italian vessels that the Americans brought in on merchant ships with a special area in the tanker, for example, you had a door in the bottom of the tanker where the submarine could go in and out without anyone seeing it.
Sounds a little bit James Bondish, but James Bond is often, from the technical side, quite real. Yeah.
Yes, he probably learned it from this. So
it's not that he was first, but the point is that what I want to stress is this been done already in World War II. So they were Italian. The Italians were the ones who were world champions with Navy SEAL, so to speak. They invented that, and mini submarines. They also invented that. So they were the ones that everybody looked to how it could be done. This is, for Germans, it might sound strange because there's the idea that Italy was not very efficient in World War II, but this Flottiglia Decima Mars was the model for all special operations units after Second World War. And they were very effective, very effective. Yeah.
And the Americans, from the 60s, the Americans used small Italian vessels, and what later became the Navy SEALs used these small Italian vessels. So that was and the point was that with the regular submarines, you couldn't go into archipelagos. You couldn't go into the naval bases of a foreign country, or not very easily, at least. I mean, the very big naval bases the Russians had, actually U.S. submarines had entered these bases areas. But with regular naval bases, they couldn't go in. And so they used these small vessels that they brought in a compartment of a regular merchant ship. And that was, I think 6 sources on these hydrophones that they used these special hydrophones that were maintained by small submarines along the Swedish coast. And this was, I think, this was the foundation for the Swedish operations in the 1980s. You had this system with merchant ships going in with the small midget submarines, and they were almost never observed, and the submarines were almost never observed. But what you could do is to let them show up in the Swedish archipelagos and naval bases and demonstrate their presence. And that's what they did from 81 onwards. So that was, and it was extremely sophisticated, you could say. I mean, you had the system that already functioned, and you used it for another purpose.
Yes.
And the Swedes and the Norwegians and the Europeans in general changed their mind about what Soviet Union was. Of course, you had the Afghanistan operation at the same time, which was made people, to some extent worried. But this was, far away. This was not Europe. So what happened here was intrusions into other countries, deep into other countries. It was like the coming, tanks going on the bottom of the floor, seafloor almost, So it was a perception of an invading force, going into your own territory. Mm-hmm. And I mean, one very outspoken naval officer, Hans von Hofsten, he argued that you had this kind of observations of submarines every single day. I mean, that was an exaggeration, but still, it was this he said on Swedish TV news.
Mm-hmm. So I think we have to understand that this means that the Swedish social democratic détente policy is becoming powerless. It's discredited because they talk to the Soviets. And what do the Soviets do? They swim around in Soviet water and in Swedish waters and do whatever they want. This is the perception that is transported via the media, who don't know what's going on, and they have information from the military, and nobody really knows what's going on, but everybody assumes it's Soviet because of that first instance with the Soviet submarine, but also this is the story that is that's told in public, and the people in the military who are usually more on the conservative side, and the police forces who are more on the conservative side, get the idea that there might be something wrong with the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme. I have it from Stasi files where they say that officers in Sweden think that he's collaborating with the Soviets, that he lets Soviet submarines out when they are under investigation or are attacked. They are attacked with real weapons in Swedish waters, and that there is a secret collaboration because he is a friend of the Soviets. So This is very important. It's not only a military story that we tell here, it is the build-up to get Olof Palme into a person that is either loved or hated, and hated so much that people start to contemplate to take him out.
Yes. No, it was from autumn 1985, it was started what was called the Naval Officers' Revolt, which was, I think, 12 naval officers that came out and said that we don't trust Prime Minister Palme. And when I spoke with a lot of naval officers, they said, we believed, they received ceasefire orders when a submarine was coming. They knew from the sound signatures and so on, a submarine was on its way out. And this was the Coastal Defense Command at Mälsten. And they knew that the submarine was on the way out, and they received ceasefire order. And first they actually had detonated a mine, a 600-kilo mine, against the submarine, which was damaged. And you had the sound people. I mean, the sonar operators dealing with the hydrophones, listening what's going on in the water. They heard repairing with hammers and so on, repairing noise, and they also heard very specific sounds that are from a valve that were you could pinpoint the exact position of the submarine because you have several hydrophones, so you could triangulate. And it was very clear that it was a damaged submarine, and it went out. They got orders not to use more force against it, and then the second submarine was when the second submarine was passing out. They got ceasefire order, and then 5 hours later, when it had passed out, they were able to use force again, and they could not imagine that this was their own admirals who had given that order. They thought this must be the prime minister. The prime minister was too close to the Soviets. This must be a prime minister who did it. But what the Russians say, or what the Soviet leadership said, was use more force on Andropov. I mean, this was in. He had a meeting with Koivisto, the Finnish president, in June 1983, and he told him, "Tell the Swedes that they should use more force against these submarines, and to sink these submarines because it's not ours."
That is important. So it's also the ambassador, the Soviet ambassador in Sweden, Boris Pankin, told in the interview that I've done with him the same. So they were indicating to the Swedish people, sink, destroy a submarine, because you will see it's not ours. And in my first documentary, we have the chief of the coastal command, General Hansen. And he is told by his boss, a Swedish admiral, that he shouldn't use force because we don't want a bloodbath among the Soviet soldiers, the seamen that are in the submarines. And of course, what is your purpose as a soldier? To create bloodbaths. That is the topic why you exist. But the important thing is, this is all not in the public. The public does not know anything about it. They were not informed by the media that the Soviets said, okay, blow them up, it's not ours, we don't care, you will see who it is. But in the public, the idea is it's Soviet submarines, and somehow Palme is collaborating with the Soviets to achieve his plan of a socialist future with the Soviet Union, blah, 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 something like that. So at the same time, I think this is very important to understand. There's a growing sentiment in the security apparatus in Sweden that somebody has to be brave enough to do something about it. And that gets to the point where somebody says, we have to take him out. Maybe you can tell that story. And then there's an interview in SVT.
Yeah. No, it was a Commodore, head of the Berga Naval College, Kai Holmberg, who said that he had spoken with his subordinate Hans von Hofsten that I mentioned before, who was supposedly heading this naval officers' revolt, and he said that they had meetings with naval officers and police officers, that they had to do something. they had to get rid of Olof Palme in one way or another, and they hadn't discussed any specifics. He said, in this Commodore, he said that they hadn't discussed any specifics about how to take him out, but still there were these kind of sentiments, as you said. I mean, in the naval, among naval officers, and of course this became.
And I recall the interview. I read a transcript, and then he was asked, "What do you mean with take him out?" And he answers, "Physically or politically, whatever. He just has to be taken out." So it was open to murder already.
Yeah. No, that was it was a discussion, and the state secretary for Olof Palme in the Prime Minister's office, Ulf Larsson, he said that in an also tape-recorded interview, that he and Olof Palme got information about a group of police officers and naval officers and so on that wanted to get rid of Olof Palme, and that they had meetings in the Old Town in Stockholm, and what he remembered was that they also used this Sieg Heil, or at least some of the people were having a Hitler salute, so to speak, which you don't do in Sweden regularly. and this is and these were people who were, willing to take him out. That was clear. It's.
And I think this is also, I would like to mention it because my documentary was bought by Swedish TV, but then not transmitted to the public, because the head of the documentary considered there was a discussion even in a newspaper where some people said, why isn't it shown? It was aired in Germany, in France, and in Denmark, so why not in Sweden? And that was, I would say, it was quite insulting. What the whole thing with the strange case of the submarine that ran aground, which where I had done interviews and had real information, and then this case, connecting it to the case in Sweden. That is something that is so touchy in Sweden that they refrain from there. Yeah. There's always this tendency to refrain. It's also, I will tell that now that we go on to your bombshell then, but I was contacted by an American colleague who was a intelligence specialist and correspondent, and he said, when I interviewed him about that Swedish case with a submarine running aground, and he made reports that said this is something that was pre-planned. I got interested in that. He said it was obvious that it was pre-planned because it was also the reaction in the media was pre-planned. There were people informed beforehand. And this is only done in an intelligence operation. So I did an interview and asked him, and then he said, yeah, but I don't know so much about the Swedish story. I know more about the German story. And I said, what German story? And to tell that very short, he said that in 1982, the Schmidt government was ended by a vote of no confidence in the German parliament. And he said that was done by the aiding help of the CIA in Germany, which used the Free Democrats who were broke and already was split into two factions where one was leaning towards Helmut Kohl to the conservative side and the others to the social democratic side. And it was anyhow a split situation, and they just had to do a little bit to switch it to the Helmut Kohl side. And they did that with the help of bribing and money. And so he told me, I have two sources from the Reagan government which we could interview in that, because I asked him, what about proof for that? And so on. He said, maybe we can get them to an interview. So I informed ZDF about it and said, why don't we do, please just said, tried to make a good offer and said, just pay for the flight. We do the interviews and the pay for flight and camera crew. I come back with the interviews, and then we can decide together if the interviews are strong enough to proceed on airing that, because that would be a bombshell in Germany to hear that the German government was toppled with a friendly help from the CIA and from the American government, you could say. And they heard about it and said, that's a very interesting story, we definitely have to do it, and then dropped it like a hot potato and did nothing afterwards. And when I did try to do interviews, and we come to that with Doug McEachen, who was important in the story that you are going to tell, that was shelved. It was shelved by the production company or by ZDF, I don't know, but it was impossible for me to do it. They made sure I couldn't interview the guy who told me that story. They made sure that it didn't happen, the interview with the two people from the Reagan administration. And meanwhile, everybody is dead. They are not there available anymore. But the obviously the purpose that the story would never come out was achieved. And that is, you have to understand for the viewers that the situation in Sweden to this day is that it's very strange. What you just told is not the public knowledge in Sweden that is accepted. Up to now, when I talk to Swedes, if they know about it, and everybody has heard about it and knows from the past that this was a major topic at the time, but then it's somehow murky. It's kind of JFK-ish, I would call it. And some say this, some say that. Maybe it was herrings farting. They all get kinds of funny stories. No. It's not clear. And until now, especially, it was not clear. Although some people from the Palme government that I interviewed and spoke to, that you helped me to get in contact with, were quite clear. They said we knew what was going on, but it was, you would accuse the Swedish military of committing treason when you say that they work together with the Americans against their own government. That is something to say that. One guy said you have to have a lot of ground under your feet to state something like that. So up to now it is unclear, but now we come, because was it Soviet or not? There's so much evidence of what you described.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I could say also that I wrote a book that was published 2019, 1.2 kilos.
The book does not have the title 1.2 kilos,
and about the submarines.
Yeah.
And the former ambassador to Moscow, 10 years ambassador to Moscow, Sven Hirdman, and he was deputy in the defense ministry and actually acting according to the chief of defense. He was acting defense minister and so on. And then, secondly, it was the deputy in the foreign ministry who was responsible for the submarine issues, Pierre Choury, then it was Ambassador Matthias Mossberg, who was responsible for a while for Soviet study in the foreign ministry, and he was also the responsible for the policy planning section and so on in the foreign ministry, and then fourthly, it was the most senior defense reporter from Svenska Dagbladet, the conservative newspaper. They all wrote a review of my book. It was a very positive review of my book. And no newspaper wanted it. I mean, this is the single most important people in dealing with these issues in the 1980s. And none of the four major newspapers wanted the article. Mm-hmm. So this says something that it's touchy.
Yeah.
But maybe we could go back to McEachen.
We have to get back to the whole story. So there is in the first documentary, which I again recommend to watch. From about the middle, it is in Feindlichen Tiefen or in Enemy's Depth, it's called. It has been aired in a lot of countries, including Russia, by the way, in Canada, United States, and in Russia,
and Britain,
and Australia. So it is, but always, if it was in the West, it was always somehow edited. In the end, for example, the general who said I was used as an useful idiot, the Swedish general, he's taken out conveniently. But so be that as it may, we have this situation that the submarines are there. And the Swedish military, some of the people that you described who wanted to smash the submarines, they thought it was Soviet. Yeah, they were, but they noticed they were prevented from doing it from somebody from above. They got radio calls in from the headquarters to say, don't use water bombs and things like that. So they assumed immediately it was, all of them assumed it was not that it was their own military command in collusion with the Americans, but Palme in collusion with the Soviets.
Yeah.
That was the assumption.
Yeah. Depth charges.
Depth charges, yeah.
No, and what in 1985, I had contact with some military officers, and one guy told that his friend diver had been diving at after use of depth charges in Horsfjärden, close to the Musco naval base, very close.
Let me get in there once again, because what I wanted to explain is the situation is we don't, up till now officially, we don't know if the Swedish military really did know, as you say, about that it was Western submarines. There's enough evidence, but the case that we're going to present now, which is your case, which is going to present it in this program, because it's very difficult to present it somewhere else, like my story with the German government. These things are so touchy that journalism doesn't work anymore. They stay away from it. They do not inform the public about what's going on, but rather they know that it would be detrimental to their career to report it. So what is coming now is the first proof that somebody in the Swedish military must have known what is going on, and this information has not been proceeded inside Sweden in the public to the politicians. So the case that you're going to present is the core case to understand that there was something fishy and that it's not a mistake, it's intention. This is why it's so important.
Yeah, no, but it was I got in contact with, I had some of this contact with people who were, diving also. And one diver... Military divers. I have to say, not divers. You always say divers, but that means military divers. It was, and he went down and attached a wire to small vessels, a small midget submarine or whatever. And that's what his job, and he had to sign papers and never speak with anyone about it. But he spoke with someone and so on. And I called, the idea was that three of us should meet
maybe I again have to interrupt a little bit, because he contacted you because you had been the civilian experts in the third investigation.
No.
He didn't?
No, this was much earlier.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, then
this was,
proceed. So you were a known expert in Sweden for the submarine case.
I was dealing with security policy and so on, and could have some input in why this happens. And we were I called him from my stepfather's telephone, and we were going to meet Tuesday morning, 1 day and a half later, and I got his door code and he was going to wash clothes and so on, and everything was in order, and I gave him my telephone number, and then he called the next day and said it's not possible, and then he had been transferred to North Sweden.
But it was what I wanted to go to. It is because you said he had to attach a wire to a mini sub. That doesn't sound very spectacular. It is not any mini sub, and the reason why he wanted to call you is this was a special occurrence, and maybe you have to explain a little bit of that, because it's like a diver telling you he had to attach a wire to something is not.
It's on this. It was on the bottom of the. It was on the seafloor, and so he and it was after a depth charge had been dropped, and it supposedly had been dropped almost hitting the small midget, and so that was
which was considered to be a Soviet midget.
Yeah. Everyone.
But you have to explain that because our viewers don't know it. So there was a hunt on a submarine. A depth charge was dropped. They knew that there was some damage, and now this diver comes to you and say, "I had to attach a wire to a mini sub that lay on the ground or on the seabed." So this is why it is interesting.
And he was transferred to North Sweden, left his apartment, his girlfriend, and did not come back. And I tried to reach him 15 years later, and I did reach him, and he said that he knew that I was going to call.
After 15 years.
Yeah. So, okay. And at that time I was in the official inquiry, and I called from the defense ministry in Stockholm and so on, but he said he wasn't at Muskö at the time, which others said he was, and so on. But
so he wanted to stay away from this.
Yeah. And of course he didn't want to speak, and that's fair enough. But it's. But I think when I wrote a book in 2001 on these submarine issues, I've been in this inquiry, and you had an inquiry. The reason for the inquiry was that the American Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, and then shortly afterwards the British Navy Minister, Keith Speed, they both have said that we operated regularly and frequently submarines in Swedish waters. And that we did, it was necessary to test the Swedish readiness, the Swedish naval readiness, and so on. And of course, then the officer corps could not be informed because you couldn't test if they informed him beforehand. But on the top level, you had a couple of people. And Keith Speed told another journalist, Pelle Neroth, that he was doing interview for Sunday Times, that it was the Chief of Defense Staff or the flag officer submarines who spoke with his Swedish counterpart. So this was two people, and you could say that one person had been flag officer submarines in Sweden, or chief of the submarine flotilla, and then after that, chief of defense staff. And so this was, you could say, most likely the person who was involved from the British side, and he was also the one who gave the ceasefire order in 1982 when the submarine was going to pass. The
incident you described.
Yes,
yes,
exactly. So this is and it was my colleague in this inquiry, who was the Secretary General of the inquiry, Mattias Mossberg, Ambassador Mattias Mossberg. He was in this archive from the naval base, and he found one document about that was relatively new about the interview with Caspar Weinberger and how some admirals should coordinate their wording, their way of speaking about this incident, because what Caspar Weinberger have said, they had to, find wording that could be used, that could, in a way, justify their positions and so on. And this was, of course, extremely important because that was the reason why the inquiry was established in the first place by the Prime Minister. And then the naval officer in this inquiry, he said, "We already have this document at the ministry. We have it." So he didn't have to copy it. And then when they came back to Stockholm, they didn't have this document. This was just he was just lying. Mm. And when Matthias Mossberg came back to the archive shortly afterwards, this document was no longer to be found. So it means that the naval officer who was an admiral in the inquiry, he had obviously lied first in the first place and then fixed so the document was gone afterwards. And this says something about the way one could work in the inquiry also. Mm-hmm. It was, but what happened couple of years later, in 2002 maybe, I wrote a English paper that I presented at the Nobel Institute. The Nobel Institute had some historian that were staying at the Nobel Institute for doing research and so on, and so from international, from U.S., Italy, Britain, or whatever, and I made a presentation about this submarine case in Swedish waters, about the use of Western submarines, and one later, one guy who had 30 years from CIA behind him, he was interested in it, and he later became chief historian for the CIA. And then we had a bigger seminar, and there Bill Odom, who was a former chief of National Security Agency and Army Intelligence and the military advisor to Brzezinski during the Carter administration. He was there, and Douglas McKekin, who was a deputy CIA for intelligence. He was responsible for intelligence inside the CIA in the early 90s, but before that he was heading the operations center in the early 80s, and he was heading the Soviet intelligence in mid 80s, and I asked him about this submarine case in Sweden in 82, and he said it was something of an underwater U2 or underwater U2 incident, he said, mm-hmm. and which was quite remarkable statement. And I said, but because if you compared it to the U2...
We get into that, we have to explain why U2 is important. But so there was a top guy from the CIA, was responsible for the intelligence about the Soviet Union in the CIA, became deputy director intelligence later on. So big cat of the CIA told you that there was an incident with a mini sub that he called an underwater U2 incident.
And this fit pretty well with what this diver said, and when other diver, but he was also at the health at the medical center.
We have to talk about that. That is all very important.
Yeah,
so there's
one
diver who's approached you and said, I had to attach a steel wire probably to race. This is the reason why it was attached to a mini sub that was lying on ground, and it was probably lying on ground because it was damaged. But what he knew is he had to attach it, and there was a mini sub. And this whole thing was secret, very secret. And then also from there, you have this story about a diver, and you have an American diver, a U.S. diver. You have to tell that story because it fits.
No, after my first book, the first submarine book in 2001, I was approached by a guy who had been a diver, but he was also at the medical center, and he told about that it had been the helicopter division came with it carrying on a diver that they picked up, and who was an American diver, and he was not seriously wounded or so on, so he survived, and they asked about who he was and so on. He just pointed down that he was coming from the below.
But he didn't say a word.
He didn't say a word, and they called him Ohio. But that was just because they had to have an American word on it. And then after an hour came an embassy car from the U.S. Embassy, they said, that picked him up.
So there were witnesses telling that story?
There were one more, but the newspaper, I think Dagens Nyheter, wanted to make a story about it, but it was another witness, and he didn't want to say anything. Mm-hmm. And so they couldn't make a story of it because they just have this witness. But the impression, of course, is that you have a mini sub that is sank or damaged seriously, and you have a surviving pilot. And that was what, in 1960, you have the U-2 incident in Soviet Union.
Let's get into it. So what we have up to now is one diver approaching you, telling you that he would like to tell you the story about why he had to attach to a mini sub on the ground of the seabed.
I approached him.
You approached him, okay. And we have the story about someone who tells that there had been a diver who would not speak a word, but when they asked him where he came from, he made this sign and was picked up by a car from the American embassy later on, who was connected to that incident. So this is what we have up to now as evidence. And now I think we have to explain why underwater U-2 used by Doug McEachen, I don't know, okay. McEachen, E-A-C-H-E-I-N, I guess is his name. So Doug McEachen, that is the third source. The third source that is speaking about an underwater U-2 incident that happened.
Or you could also say that the Norwegian chief of policy planning.
We get one after the other.
Okay.
One after the other. It's just, this is the third. So this guy, and this is important because the U-2 incident, I can explain that because I've been into that quite a lot. That was my first documentary on the spy flights. So U-2, to put it very shortly, is an American spy plane that can fly very high, very high. It couldn't be reached by fighter planes at that time. It was flying 25 kilometers up. More than 70,000 feet. So, and for a long time, its first flight into Soviet Union was in 1956, going from Wiesbaden, and it was so high that it couldn't reach by the first rockets at that time. So it was off limits. And now the important thing, I will get very shortly into that, is that these flights were operated by the CIA. The U-2 was a CIA spy plane. And the reason is that the Americans, of course, had Air Force in reconnaissance and spy planes. But some people in the American military who at that time in the 50s and the 50s, I'd say mostly in the 50s, after the Soviet Union got the nuclear bomb, they said, we'll have a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Inevitable. So best we have it now, when the Soviet Union is still weak. So we need to do the fighting with the Soviet Union now to get rid of that threat once and for all. And they were thinking that the political side, which was General Eisenhower, the head of the Allied Expeditionary Forces Europe, he had been in Second World War. They considered him somehow too weak for, and not hard enough, not hardballed enough to do the fighting. He didn't want it. So some of for example, the chief of the Strategic Air Command, Curtis LeMay and Tommy Powers, they intentionally flew into Soviet airspace to start World War III. They even talked about it, and there were in the newspapers some people from the War College and somebody from the Navy, highest people were talking about this need to start World War III now. So Eisenhower took away these flights which would go into the Soviet Union, took it away from the Air Force and put it into the CIA, and also ordered every flight had to be signed by him personally. On the morning when the flight started on the day before, he had to sign the order that the flight would go or it wouldn't go if it didn't bear a signature. So he took the control of these flights away, and these planes, the CIA flights, were of utmost importance because the CIA didn't know what was going on inside Soviet Union. There was a lot of talk. The Soviets were boasting about their capability to produce bombers and to produce rockets. And then the American military said, and if they say they can produce 10, probably they have 100. They boasted it again. So the Soviet threat became an enormous inflated puppet bear, 20 feet inflated, hot air, nothing. And the U-2 proved with the photos that they did that there was no threat from the Soviet Union. They didn't have hundreds of bombers. They were spilling out rockets like sausages, which they were telling. It was so that it proved it was all hot air. It was of utmost importance. So they were going on flying, and the Americans thought they could. They already knew that the Soviets had capabilities. They had MiG-19, which could not really reach it, but maybe try in a ballistic way, go up, shoot, or they had rockets. So they thought sooner or later the U-2 would be shot down. And that happened in 1960. In 1960, a plane that flew, Francis Gary Powers, many people have heard that name, flew from Peshawar in Pakistan, and was shot down over Sverdlovsk. In the shutdown, they also shot down a Soviet fighter chasing him. That's weird. And the Americans thought, they considered it impossible because it was so high that the pilot would survive. But Francis Gary Powers managed to get out of the cockpit, and he survived the crash. But the Soviets kept that secret. So the Soviets had the plane, they had the living pilot, and they had the camera with the footage in it. Yeah. So everything they kept secret, and the Americans lied their ass off in the next days and were telling that it was a weather reconnaissance flight. It went astray. And also Powers had a silver dollar with a poisoned needle in it. He was supposed to kill himself if he would survive the crash, but he didn't. He didn't kill himself. So the Soviets waited, and then after 1 week, they presented Powers to the world, and Khrushchev said, obviously Eisenhower is not in charge because he doesn't know what's going on inside his country. Either that, he was pointing to Allen Dulles. So it was the biggest scandal at that time, was this American plane flying over Soviet territory, the Americans lying about it, and the Soviets could prove that they did it. So the U-2 means sneaking intelligence into foreign territory, lying about it, and then being caught with your pants down.
Yeah, and with one surviving pilot, and
that's it.
And so on.
So when McEakin talks about an underwater U-2, that is because everybody of that in that time frame knew about this story. Is the hint what it was?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that was And I, when he said it, I said, but the Swedes never went public. I said, different from the Soviets. so that made a big fuss about it. And then.
But we get into the other sources also. Don't forget
But and then McKechnie turned to the third person present was Ben Fischer, who was the CIA also.
CIA historian. He was the chief CIA historian.
Yeah, but he was both operation and for a long time and in analysis. So I think it's 30 years or something. But McKechnie asked him, "Do you know what we are talking about?" And he said, "Yes," because Ola presented his paper at the Nobel Institute, and then he said, "Aha." And then he didn't want to speak more about it, so to speak. But it was obvious that because another person present understood what we were talking about, he didn't want to say more. But I asked him later about who I should talk to, and he said, and in addition to his Bill Studemann, who obviously knew, because he was his superior, and then he said Rick Haver, who was he was deputy naval intelligence for a long time, but he was also Cheney's top intelligence guy when he was defense minister, and later he was Rumsfeld's top intelligence guy as a defense minister.
So these are people at the very top of the food chain of knowledge of intelligence operations.
Yeah. So that was clear that this was significant, and when I met John Lehman, who was the Secretary of Navy, a couple of years afterwards at a seminar or conference, and he was, he confirmed that they used Italian vessels. I asked why they did it, used it, and he said for plausible deniability. So it was but I didn't ask him about this case, and then I knew that you were going to interview John Lehman, so I asked you to check it out, and you said, and I have it on tape, and you.
Where did you get that from?
and he said, you said that. What does it mean with underwater U-2?
I wanted him to
in Swedish waters, 1982.
Yes, I wanted first if he would say what underwater U-2. I don't know what you're talking about, but he knew very well what I was talking about.
He didn't say what. He said it was not only U.S. submarines who went into the waters of other nations, but it was all the other NATO submarines from other NATO countries, and the Swedish incident fall in that category.
Yes, exactly.
And that means that it was, either British, German, or Italian, but almost everything point to Italian. And
he also mentioned in that interview, not related to this incident, but that was also interesting to me, that the Germans can be very proud about their contributions. And this is never made clear from the German side what the contributions of Germany were in the Swedish submarine affair. I only once was called by an admiral, and he wanted to talk me out of I shouldn't listen to you and it's all bullshit and so on.
The Americans doesn't know anything, as you know.
And then he said one thing for sure is that I have to stress that Germany was not involved in this incident at all. I'm not so sure about it after the interview with Lehman, and then I don't know if this guy would know, but there's always the tendency to shut you down. It's also to shut me down, to shut you down. Don't talk about it. And there's different methods. And one method is to say that it's all bullshit. Yeah. Don't ridicule yourself. Or we do it.
One guy who knew, a Swedish guy, and then I presented my evidence and so on, and they said, yes, but you shouldn't write about it the coming 20 years. So, and this was, I guess, 10, 15 years ago. So I'm soon allowed to do it. But it was clear that this was it was under U.S. command. Otherwise, it wouldn't be an underwater U-2. But it was not, the submarine in itself was not American submarine. And there was a meeting, a man I knew who was, it was at the time the Italians came out and said that it was negotiations between the Swedes and the power responsible for the submarine incidents or intrusions. And everyone at the time believed it was Soviet Union, and it was in Geneva. And the foreign ministry denied it and said, we have had nothing with it. It was the Italian news agency ANSA and the Italian radio. And the Italian radio went out and said it was a Western country, actually. And ANSA said they didn't know, so to speak, but I got the source. And the source told me, yes, it was an Italian source. Told me that it was 4 Americans and 2 Swedes meeting in Geneva and 1 Italian, and the Italian intelligence officer and the name of the Italian officer, and they. It was the only reason why it would be an Italian present at that meeting would be that the midget was Italian. And so that was, and the Swedes were not from the foreign ministry. There were one industrial or financial guy and one officer or retired officer. So these, and they decided that we have to stop the hunting now. For the submarines had to go out, and that was also the reason why this chief of staff, Bror Stephenson, let the submarine out. I mean, almost certainly. I mean, they had used 42 depth charges against the submarine the first week. The second week they used 2, and this was actually it was this coastal defense base at Melsten with Lieutenant Colonel Sven-Olof Kviman, who didn't consider him to be directly under the naval base. So he didn't follow the recommendations in all. I mean, he followed recommendation from his superior, who was then under the military district. So that was. But when so what he did, he was not allowed to use the bottom-mounted mines for this second submarine passing out. So what he did was to put depth charges, 16 depth charges that would go into attack four patrol vessels with 4, I think each, no more. Oh, I don't remember. It was they should have a carpet of depth charges over the submarine, and then they had the helicopter was going, had contact with the submarine, and said 150 meters left, 100 meters left, 50 meters left, and then it comes counter order from the naval base saying you are only allowed to drop 2, and they were confused because I mean this never happens, that you intrude into the to the military operation with a counter order like that.
That is in my documentary.
Yes.
In Enemy's Depth, Sven Olof Kviman told that in the interview exactly this moment.
Yes.
Where he said he was under tension. Now it would happen, and then they get the order. It's basically if you drop 2, it's like stop.
Yes. Yeah. So what? But the point was that this was the only 2 dropped the second week, and so it was clear that something had happened, and there was a decision to stop the use of depth charges.
Let's get back to this underwater U2 incident. You were mentioning a Norwegian intelligence officer. You haven't told about him.
Yeah, it was. So what I mentioned was the Norwegian. A man called Einar Anstensen, who was actually the close advisor to Foreign Minister Lange during the U2 incident in 1960, and he was a mentor for Foreign Minister Knut Frydenlund and for Thorvald Stoltenberg, who later became foreign ministers. And he was heading the political division and the policy planning division in the Norwegian Foreign Ministry for 15 years. And in 82, he was at the embassy Norwegian embassy in Stockholm, and he was invited to the naval attaché during the submarine hunt, and he was told then that they had sunk or damaged U.S. or a vessel or a submarine under U.S. command, and that was probably exactly days after that, or maybe I don't know, the same day or whatever, when they sank this submarine. So it's and he told me that in 1999, I think. Yes, December 1999, I think. And I had a coffee at the place of Foreign Minister Frydenlund's political advisor, Bernt Bull, and then Einar Anstensen was there, and he knew that I was interested in these submarine stories or events, and so he told it. And then, but he didn't want to tell more. He just told that he told it to the Swedish. He told it also to the Norwegian Chief of Defense. But not to the Swedish Chief of Defense, or not to Olof Palme, that he knew quite well, because it was very, very secret and very sensitive. So that's you could say it's. So when I came the year before, the coming year, I was in this. Submarine inquiry, it was 2001, and I told Rolf Ekéus, who was then as former ambassador to Washington and responsible for in the 1990s for this disarming of Saddam Hussein and so on, or the chemical weapons issues and so on, and I told him. about what Einar Anstensen had said, and he knew Einar Anstensen very well, and so on. So we concluded that I should talk to Einar Anstensen when I was back in Oslo some days later. And then I arrived in Oslo, and he was dead just a few days before, and I was at his funeral and at coffee afterwards, and I was sitting close to Arne Arneson, the former ambassador to Copenhagen, and I told what I was, he asked what I was doing, and I was in this inquiry, and I said that what Einar had said, and he said that are the Swedes mature enough for that, which would indicate that he either knew about it or didn't think well enough about the Swedes. But actually, he was Einar Anstensen was a mentor for Knut Frydenlund, for Thorvald Stoltenberg, and for Arne Arneson.
So if we wrap it up, it means that because this submarine incident happened underwater, you have witnesses from the United States, witnesses in a way from Norway, from Sweden, that there must have been people who knew about it, because keeping it so secret is the reason is because it's so sensitive, and that is because this shouldn't go to the public, because it would destroy the whole operation.
Yeah, you could say that Anders Hasselbom, journalist. Yes, he wrote a story in 1983. He had some Norwegian sources actually, and he wrote a story in spring 1983 that they said it's Western submarine, and he was the only one. And he was writing for Dagens Industri, also daily industry, and then he wrote a book in 1984 that came out summer '84, and one of his sources said to him that I told that these are Western submarines. They passed out. Also, this was also what the Chief of Army said, that they passed out through the two regular submarines, conventional submarines, went out through Öresund, between also the Danish Strait, and the Swedes had photo of it also, and they. But one guy told that if the 1983 inquiry will not point to the West, as these were actually Western submarines, then come back to me. Mm-hmm. And then he did that, because the inquiry didn't say anything. They said it absolutely nothing from the West here, and so Anders Hasselbom called him. And he answered in the telephone, and then said, "I don't know who you are. I've never spoken with you."
Yeah,
and go
this
to the information.
This is what we encountered all the time. It is this is at the very it's very, very secret. So if you touch it, this is what in the United States is called a third rail issue. You can as well touch the electric wire in a train station. The same will happen to you. It will not propel your career. It will end your career. This is, in a way, you would have been the designated new chief of Peace Research Institute Oslo. You were qualified for that. But instead it became somebody who came from British aerospace and was before had a background in agriculture. So you can see, but he was truly on the Western side. So, and for me, it was the end. I quit working for ZDF because I noticed that it was simply not possible to tell the truth. There were too many. It was a glass ceiling. It was not possible. They were not interested in all these stories. And the more I could prove, the more difficult it got for me. So this also means that the journalism, as people think that you try to find somebody, you have a witness, you have this enemy of the state, and he gets to somebody from the New York Times and he tells them. And then the next picture on the film is you see the newspaper printing machine rolling, and it spills out, and the world knows, and the world is safe, and Western democracies are safe. Not true. The way it is, if it really would happen, next thing you would see that this guy would be taken somewhere else.
What people, I mean, what John Wesley, who was the chairman of Joint Chief of Staff, and I met him at the conference, and we had a lunch, and he said about Sweden that when it comes to Sweden, there is only one rule: nothing on paper. And that was that I spoke with. Also, Caspar Weinberger said that during my years in the 1980s, I mean, John Wesley was his chairman of Joint Chief of Staff, and Caspar Weinberger said it was only consultations and understanding. There was nothing on paper. Mm-hmm. And also the James Schlesinger, who I met at a lunch with at another conference, and who was a director of Central Intelligence, CIA, and Secretary of Defense during the Nixon administration, and to some extent Ford. He said that when I asked him about Sweden, what his view on Sweden during his time and so on, and he said, which Sweden? The political Sweden or the military Sweden? The military was planning for us to come as soon as possible. So it was obvious that it was not, all military. It was just a small group of very senior officers, not necessarily on the very top, that were collaborating hand in glove with the Americans. And while the political side wanted to have neutrality.
And this is also what when I did the interview with James Lyons, the second man of the US Navy, and he said the Swedes were holding the code for us. And all of that was not supposed to go to the Swedish public, as we heard.
Yes.
So thank you for. Okay, you want to say something? Okay.
Yeah, I just want to say that the interview with Lyons is very interesting in a sense. I mean, I was tipped off that he was heading this operation in Swedish waters, and it was from the CIA. It was actually from the CIA, top CIA guy Fritz Ermath, and he. And Fritz and Ace Lyons, who was the very close to Secretary of Navy John Lehman, they were really hand in glove, so to speak, and close friends. And Ace Lyons said that I did it in your interview.
Yes.
And
he was so proud about it. He was,
and he said it was me and my staff.
Yes.
That did these operations. And he was perhaps a little bit disappointed afterwards, but he had obviously told too much.
Yes,
and
I remember that very well. The way he went out, he he thought that the documentary would be a hero story, how he helped or was essential in winning the Cold War, and then he noticed at the end of the interview that. This would probably not be the case, and he walked out like from a interrogation in North Korea, very stiff upwards. And for him, he noticed that he had told too much, and but it was still not enough for anybody in ZDF to go berserk about it. Yeah. It was not enough.
I spoke with one Navy guy who had some contact, and he said that he told too much.
Yeah. So these events are not only history; they are in a way present. And for me, the question in the back of my mind, it lingers in the back of my mind, is how is it possible that Sweden decided to get rid of its neutrality, and how could Finland decide to get rid of its neutrality after these events? And these are things that are not completely unknown in political circles and military and intelligence, at least not. So hard to grasp for me why would you become a member of this club of NATO under American command, doing these kind of nasty things and doing this to governments in Scandinavia?
Yeah. No, you could say that in 2014, there were new events of submarine intrusions into Stockholm archipelago and so on. And these were, every journalist and officer that were interviewed claimed that these must be Russian submarines.
Again.
and you had, after these statements by Caspar Weinberger in year 2000, I think it was 60% and so on said that of the population said that, it might be Western submarines also, or at least Western submarines and so on. But just a few years later, 10 years, 15 years later, this is forgotten. And then people said, yes, it definitely must be the Russians. And there were absolutely no indication, nothing pointed in this direction, and they said you had submarines and so on. At the time, Russia had one submarine in the Baltic Sea, and it was not. And they didn't have really immediate submarines to go in for a longer period or something like that. So it was very, very, obvious that this was driven by some people, and they interviewed me, and I said that there is nothing that indicates kind of Russian presence or something like that, and secondly, they don't have any subs really. So it became very strange, but then it was in the from 14 to 16, and you also have this claim about Russia's role in Ukraine and so on, and this was certain groups inside the military that wanted to have ties to the West, and of course they wanted to be part of the club, so to speak. They wanted to be. I was at a conference in Portsmouth, many years ago, and there were some Swedes there, 4 naval officers, and it was a Royal Navy conference, and you could see that they were happy to be together with their own people, the naval people from the U.S. from Britain primarily, and then it was Norwegians or others and so on also, and these were, and you have the Princess Anne coming, shaking hands with you and so on. And this was a kind of feeling that they wanted to be part of the club. It had nothing to do with security politics, really. And the leading ambassadors in Sweden, with you have the former Foreign Minister Hans Blix, who had been, central really in when it comes to the discussions about weapons of mass destruction during the George W. Bush administration, and you have Rolf Ekéus, who had been the Iraqi inspector in the 90s, and then you had Sven Hirdman, who was a practical defense minister and so on, and ambassador to Moscow for 10 years, and ambassador to Israel, and all this, and they all said Sweden, the best for Sweden is to keep its neutrality. And one problem, of course, for the Swedes would be that if we let US use Swedish air bases, the Russians will take them out. And if it has become a war, which easily could go into nuclear war, they will use nuclear weapons to take them out. So to be part of an alliance would then not be necessarily very good for Sweden. We might not survive really, and that was, but that was not in the debate. And what happened, it was a development in Finland that I know less about, but for me it was very, very strange. But in Sweden, it was a Social Democratic Party leadership that took decision that they didn't want the NATO membership become the part of the election campaign for the next election last year. Also in 2022. Mm-hmm. So they wanted. So it was just primarily a tactical issue. Of course, some people were linked to the Americans and wanted to be part of it and so on, but it was not. And some people thought it was good to coordinate the Air Force with the Norwegian and Finns and so on, because for practical reasons, Air Force is not really about thinking too much about borders. Mm. So it was a kind of very strange development. Of course, you had the happenings or the events in Ukraine that played an important role, but this was not. I don't think that was in Swedish case, and in Finnish case, I think it was decided already before. So it was very much in Swedish case a tactical issue, and I think it's tragic. I mean, I think we had invited one person who was part of shooting down. He was actually on the spot shooting down the U-2 in 1960, and he became later responsible for planning. The military planning for the Leningrad military district. Cheremnik? Mm-hmm. And he said that, in the war that they planned for in the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s was that they would take Finland because they didn't trust the Finns really. And so a lot of forces were going to Finland. And then they would take Finnmark in the northern Norway, because they needed some buffer zone for the Kola Peninsula, and also some more fjords for the survival of the naval forces and so on. And they would try to take out Bodø and in Nordland and perhaps something in Troms and so on. But they believed that they would be able to take Finnmark, the most eastern part of northeastern Norway. And but Sweden, was not going to take Sweden. They were going to the north and perhaps take possibly a very northern part of Sweden or something like that. But it's when I asked about if the US used Swedish air bases, because there were these plans of using Swedish air bases, and the Americans.
Because Germany would have been destroyed in a war, and then the American planes would go to Sweden and use Sweden as the next base.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that was, and already from, it's not just that we're going to destroy it, but already from day one, some people argued from the Swedish Defense Ministry that the Americans would move over the aircraft based in Germany to Sweden. And then Sweden would be an unsinkable aircraft carrier. And the plan for the Soviet side, from the Soviet side, was to take out these specific air bases that the Americans could use, because they could not use all Swedish air bases, because the Swedish airplanes could take off on the shorter landing strips. So this was the point was, at the time, you couldn't do that with conventional weapons, because then you would lose enormous amount of aircraft, because you had to continuously bomb these airfields. So that means that you have to use nuclear weapons. And I think that was part of the reason why Olof Palme did not hand over this policy to his successor, Thorbjörn Fälldin, in 1976. And but the question now, what if you will have an escalation? I mean, quite likely that Polish troops. It's already a lot of Polish troops in Ukraine under, as I understand, with Ukraine uniforms and so on. But if they go in with regular troops, because the people in Ukraine will end, then there will be attacks on Poland. And the question is, what will happen? How will if the British then respond and the Russians take out the British headquarters northwards outside London with some conventional missiles, but will it escalate to a nuclear issue? And what does this mean? The American Air Force will move into maybe to North Norway and perhaps to Finland and Sweden, and then the Russians will take out these air bases. And now they have better conventional bombs to take out airfields than they had in the 70s and 80s. But the question is still, does this lead to a nuclear war? And certainly from a Swedish-Finnish point of view, it's to become members of NATO in this case is just stupid. Because the Russians are not interested in taking territory. They are just interested in destroying the American threat from the US Air Force.
Yeah, this is what I really wanted to ask, because the arguments you give are not in favor of joining NATO in this situation, but they did. And then the question is still, why? Why would they do it? And if you say there are people in the military who want to get home to NATO, where they have been for a long time before in conferences, but that is... these are what I see is a lot of female ministry secretaries of defense that do these kind of things. We have, I would call that an Annalena Baerbock effect. I see these kind of peoples everywhere, and then I don't know. This is so dangerous. What's going on, and it is for what? Really, for what? This is these are not European issues. Really, It is something like the grand chessboard power play, how to use Ukraine, and the target in sight anyhow is China, not really Russia. Russia's only a stepping stone. And it's so hard to understand for me that, we're talking about these things, and then do the people, do you think they know about the things we talked about? And then it's also, I understand from the American side, it's always, this has been very successful. If you look at that, there's a book from Peter Schweizer, Victory. This is a huge victory. They won the Cold War. So this is a method that was successful. And they will continue with this kind of operations until there is a big bang. And then we don't have time to be sorry about it. Yeah, this is the danger that I see there. But so, what is your take on that?
No, I think it's very sad. I think it's really, it's a kind of normative thinking on security policy that is, you have the right, you argue that this is the right to do. We have to spread the human rights to the others and so on. And you don't think...
Who is believing that we stand for human rights? With this track record, you can only if you're completely ignorant about politics and history since World War II. I think it's over. The West arguing that it stands for human. They are so much into Muslim people. This is why they are for the Uyghurs, and we can see it what they did in the Middle East.
Yeah. No, but you don't have. But this is not the view. I mean, you could say that people are brainwashed, but it's really brainwashed on the top level. They even. I mean, Jens Stoltenberg, I think he largely believes in what he's saying, which is tragic. I mean, I knew his father. I knew him a little bit, but I knew his wife primarily. But I knew his father, and he wrote a foreword to my book on the Barents region in 1994 or something like that. And I think Jens, that he actually believes in what he's saying. I mean, sometimes not, maybe, but it's a kind of it's a very, very dangerous game they are playing, and you play with people who are in a certain respect totally brainwashed, and how it went. I think, I mean, you could say that this submarine case, with the use of submarines, this was the first general idea how to totally change the mentality of people, how to change the political views of people. You could, as I told about the submarine case, that is, in 3 years you could change the opinion of the population totally, and that's what they are doing, and it's kind of they think they have a moral obligation to carry on this war that might easily develop into a nuclear exchange, and that's the most dangerous thing.
Okay, I think it would be interesting to have another longer discussion on this topic for the present times. But we've discussed now the submarine crisis and the new evidence that you published, and it is really that I think for the viewers of this program, that you have to understand that you won't hear these important thoughts, which are the core. If you watch CNN or BBC or ZDF, it won't work. It's only on these, let's say, fringe channels, these alternative media channels where you can discuss freely nowadays. This is why it's so important, and you can please transfer it so that those people who doubt, it doesn't make sense to talk to people who have a fixed opinion, but those who doubt that this is reasonable that we are in, and we will have to pay the price. We are all taking responsibility for the actions of our political leaders. There are channels like Telegram, there's Twitter, there's Getter, and there's also the Apolut app that you can use for that. And please inform and help us to do the job here, because nobody else will do it if we don't do it. Goodbye.
Danke, dass Sie Apolut eingeschaltet haben. Wir sind ein unabhängiges Presseportal. Uns geht es um Meinungsvielfalt, Toleranz und einen möglichst breiten Debattenraum, denn nur so funktioniert Demokratie. Unsere Arbeit ist technisch aufwendig und kostet Geld. Da Sie immer wieder hier sind, unterstützen Sie Apolut am effektivsten mit einem Dauerauftrag. Mehr Infos auf apolut.net/unterstützen. Apolut ist keine Einbahnstraße. Lassen Sie uns in Kontakt bleiben. Abonnieren Sie den Apolut Newsletter, so verpassen Sie nichts. Registrieren Sie sich auf apolut.net/newsletter. Natürlich gibt es Apolut auch als App. Einfach auf apolut.net/app runterladen und mobil auf dem Laufenden bleiben.
Apolut. Das denke ich auch.